Hello, hello, hello. Ever wanted to know how to play chess, but never got around to it? Well, this might be your lucky day, because I was thinking, who do I know more about chess than people who don't know how to play chess? And that's about it. So, today, I thought I'd give the just the basics of how chess works, and why you should play it, because it really is quite a good game. Okay, so first things first. This thing here is a board. It is where the pieces go to play. There are 64 squares on the board. It's 8 by 8. 8 across and 8 up. The side that starts at the bottom is the white side. They can be distinguished from the black side because they're coloured white. And the blacks, they start at the top. Both sides start off with the same pieces, and every piece is opposite its corresponding opponent's piece. So you'll notice that the only two pieces that don't keep the symmetry are the king and queen. These two. And they are opposite each other. So you may be thinking, oh, I've set up the board, so how do I start playing? Well, don't jump ahead of yourself, Johnny. First, you've got to know some of the basics. Like how the pieces move, and how can you be sure that you've set the board up right? Okay, so when you're setting up the board, the rooks, the castles, these ones go on the end of the first and last ranks. Then it comes the knights, the horse-looking ones, bishops, and then it comes to the confusing pieces, the king and the queen. You should always remember that, like all women, the queen wants to get her own way and wants to go on the colour square that corresponds with her dress. And the king's fine with that because he doesn't want to get into an argument with the queen, does he? Because the queen's vastly more powerful than the king. Just like in real life. But yeah, so when you're setting up, just remember the queen goes on her own colour and the king goes on the opposite one. And that should do you fine. Okay, so I've set up the board. So it's just these things called pawns. Pawns as in the crustacean. Now these little things, they'll act as your, foot soldiers in the conflict to come. They're expendable and not very mobile. But I don't think the analogy extends too far. Now pawns, they have quite an odd movement scheme. On their first move, they've got loads of energy, so they can, sprint forward they sprint forward 2 squares, or they can, trundle on 1 square forward. So, it could go like this. And now, after white's moved, it's black's turn. Then you can notice his pawn can go either one or you can trundle on 1 square forward, or you can put a move on and go 2 squares forward. Now, on the second move, white could move any of these pawns 1 or 2 squares forward, just like he did with this pawn here. But you'll notice that now that pawn has had his first move, he's run his 2 squares. He can only march on 1 square now. He's a bit tired, a bit weary, spent. Poor pawn. Can only move 1 square forward. What about if you've not used your double movement of your pawn on your first go? Well, let's see. If you didn't use your fast pawn double square sprint the first time, it isn't available to you again. You can only march forward 1 square. Just like if you'd moved it forward 2 squares on the first go. So, you can't save it up. That pawn, he's, I don't know, unfit. He doesn't want to run at all. Unless he's got something like off the starting blocks. You better be running. He's not going to run. Never. And you should notice that the pawns, then they can't move backwards. They can only move forwards. So once you've made a pawn move, there's no going back. Unlike with the other pieces, which generally have more mobility. Oh, so you may be thinking, oh, that's all well and good, but how do these pawns get down to action? What's better if they come up against an enemy pawn? A pawn of the opposite colour? Well, pawns, may move directly forward, but they take in a different manner. They take diagonally. So, let's just move this pawn. You'll see that this pawn can either move forward, take this pawn here, or take this pawn here. It can take diagonally in front of it, keeping with the whole pawn ethos of only moving forward. So, let's just take a pawn for fun. Goodbye, Mr. Black Pawn. That is the basics of what pawns do. They're quite important in chess. But there's another thing that should be mentioned about what pawns do. If you get a pawn to the opponent's end of the board, it becomes a mighty queen. So let's just march this pawn down. Or, in fact, any piece of your own colour that you want it to be. But for most of the time, you'll want the most powerful piece on the board that we'll cover later. A queen. Da, da, da. This is why you should look after your pawns, and they become very important when more of the pieces have been traded off the board. Now, in this position, I've just got the two most important, and not powerful. Definitely not powerful. Well, kind of powerful. Well, anyway, I've got the two most important pieces on the board. The two kings. They're so important that if the opponent manages to trap your king, it is lights out, game over, goodbye, good night, Mr. Tom, all of that. How do kings move? Well, kings tend to be big fat oafs. Think of Henry VIII in his later life. That is pretty much who your king represents. Mr. Fatty, who can't stumble more than 1 square at a time, but unlike the pawn, he can move in any direction. So, he can walk around, enjoy his garden, the whole ring around him, he can move, he can escape to any of the squares around him, in most cases. So, you'll notice that this king can't move to either of these two squares. That's because if he moved to either one of these, the white king would be able to take him, because unlike the pawn, wherever the king moves, he can take. Another difference to Mr. Pawn and all other pieces is that the king cannot put himself in danger, which means he cannot move to a square that he could be taken on by the enemy on their next turn, such as either of these squares where the white king could move next turn and take him. If the king cannot move anywhere and is being attacked on his own square this turn, that is what's called checkmate, and you've lost the game, unfortunately. Sorry to say that. So you have to look after your king and look to attack, kill your opponent's king. So now we move on to the rook. The rook is quite a strong piece. It can move horizontally and vertically any amount of squares it deems fit. So it has quite the breadth. And rooks really come into their own at the end parts of the game, where the board is cleared up and it really can roam. A rook is worth about 5 pawns, and so it's pretty strong and worth looking after. Next, we have the knight. The knight is a mobile and tricky customer, which has a move pattern of an L shape. 1, 2, then 1 to either side, or it could go 1 and 2 to either side. So if you look, the squares available to the knight are as follows: 1, 2, 1 to either side, 1, 1, 2 to either side, 1, 2, 1 to either side, 1, 2, 1 to either side, 1, 2, 1 to either side. Now, nothing can get in the way of a knight's path. So if you jam a pawn or something in its way, it doesn't matter, the knight can just jump out over it like it's a fence. Because horses do that. They jump over stuff. So unlike other pieces, the knight's the only one that can't get obstructed. The rook can get obstructed, the bishops and queens can get obstructed, the pawns and the king. The knight's special. Next we move on to the bishop. The bishop can only move on the diagonals, like so. It can move as many as it wants until it reaches an obstruction, unlike the knight. You start off with 2 bishops, like you do 2 knights and 2 rooks, but the 2 bishops are on opposite coloured squares, so you'd have your dark bishop here, and your light bishop, like so, controlling the other coloured squares on the board. Knights and bishops are both worth about 3 pawns each, so use that in your calculations. And finally, we move on to the most powerful, the big mama of the chessboard, the queen. It can move both like a rook and a bishop, so it can move along the horizontal and vertical paths and the diagonals, so combines the movement of the rook and the bishop. This leads to a very powerful piece that you only get 1 of, and it's worth 9 pawns. And one final thing to cover: when you attack the king, like so, notice next move the queen can take the king if he doesn't move. This is called check. Your opponent has to respond to this, move his king to a safe square. If he can't, that's checkmate. I hope this has given you a good beginning insight into chess.